We're going to look at some of the early findings so far in this research of what coalitions are doing. I want to start with just a brief snapshot of coalition work. So you can advance past that. That's the timeline that we're going to be working with. Again, apologies that this first section will be quick. There will be a full report that will be coming up hopefully within the next month that will go into greater detail. I want to just spend the next 10 minutes to look at some of the notable features that came up as I was interviewing many of you and as you were submitting information, updated information about your coalitions. To give an overall sense of this project, there are 27 coalitions that we included in this. Of those 27, 16 were also included in the 2011 study, so we have some continuity there. And then we have 11 new coalitions, although many of those coalitions existed before 2011, but CCIC is just increasing its involvement with those coalitions, or expecting to do so in the near future, so they were included. If you go to the next slide, this demonstrates some of the membership levels of coalitions. Now again, you're just seeing about half of the total coalitions, a little more than half that participated in this study, because these are the ones where we have numbers from the 2011 study that we can compare it to. What you see right there is, of 14 of the coalitions, membership levels are up by 11% overall. And on average, the coalitions experienced a 12% increase. If you click to the next thing that shows in graphic form what we're talking about, I mean, you can probably do the math yourself or figure out what we're talking about. But growth, there's marginal growth, incremental growth, I would say, in coalitions altogether.
What does the red mean on the chart?
So the green will demonstrate an increase in membership up from the blue line before. And where you see a red, if you take the highest point, that was a 2011 number, and it's down that much in the 2014. Thanks. I realized I didn't have a legend on this one, or a detailed legend on that. So this begs the question, why the change? Why are membership levels changing? Even if it is a small increase, why do we see this increase in the first place? Many of you identified a push towards internal learning. A lot of organizations were joining your coalitions because, as we've talked about this morning already, they want to be a part of a broader conversation, and they want to have, I guess, a seat at the table. Many of the benefits of coalition work was appealing to them, so working with other networks or other organizations that were working on similar thematic areas was appealing for them. We also noted a shift where we're seeing fewer policy staff and more program staff being represented in coalitions. This is generally speaking, again, these are overall trends, they may not apply directly to your coalition, but this is generally what we're seeing. More program staff than policy staff. Some of the benefits around credibility, working together, having a collective voice was cited as a reason for increasing membership. The risk management component that we've touched on before. If you speak out as an individual organization, you're more likely to be singled out than if you're working with a collective of organizations that can come forward on a common voice. Finally, there's a broader membership because some have moved to a broader mandate or a broader definition of what it means to be a member, looking towards some of the quote-unquote non-traditional actors, such as medical professionals, or expanding into academia, or working with engineers or lawyers. That was cited as an increase in membership coming from these non-traditional actors, and getting diverse voices to the table in coalition work. The next slide then is just a quick note on governance. Governance mechanisms such as having a board or executive committee or a steering committee, this is prevalent in most coalitions. About 80% still have that. That's relatively unchanged from the 2011 study. I want to just highlight a note on subcommittees. We've talked already this morning about how do you engage the diversity in your membership. And subcommittees are one response to that, where a coalition can have a broad mandate, but then may decide to drill down on a specific issue or look at a particular angle of this broader issue. Those were noted as opportunities to engage specific members who may have expertise, or just they're more interested in that dimension of the overall mandate of the coalition. There are risks involved in that, in siloing some of your work. Are you appealing to a few at the expense of the whole? Are you sure that you're targeting different groups at different times throughout the life of the coalition? These are all things to be considering. Moving on to the mandate and focus question, I want to highlight just two dynamics. So these are trends in the mandate of coalition work, especially comparing to the 2011 agenda. It's notable that educating and mobilizing the public has gained more traction. This was something in the 2011 study that was a bit of a void, where you would develop advocacy strategies, but it was up to individual members to get that, you would develop maybe a policy document, and that policy document was up to interpretation of individual members, and then they would, by extension, share that with their supporters or their constituents. We're seeing more coalitions have a more direct or a hands-on role in engaging the public through knowledge development, but also making issues tangible to the general public. We've heard that in some of the campaign initiatives that are coming forward already. We heard that this morning. The second one is the question of addressing the research void. Now, we're in the international development sector, we're aware of some of the changes that have happened in the most recent months with North-South Institute shutting its doors, and with the Halifax initiative as well, its mandate coming to an end. Who's going to pick up the slack for civil society-led research? It was interesting to see that a number of coalitions are already adopting this into their mandates. They expressed that they were doing more research. They had more specific research projects that they were working on. They were also bringing on. Is that my time?
No.
Related to research, they were bringing on consultants, perhaps. They were shifting research responsibilities onto staff. Sometimes they were bringing on part-time staff to tackle some of these research initiatives. Nonetheless, there were a number of coalitions that are expressing an interest and an increase in this, and I think that's noteworthy. Just quickly looking at the next slide and collaborating with other groups. We heard this already with the Women's Rights Policy Group and the Up for Debate campaign, how they are engaging not just Canadians, but they're engaging Canadian coalitions. And by Canadian coalitions, I guess I mean coalitions with a strictly domestic focus. Working in international development, we know that it can be a challenge to bridge some of these international issues, bridge it to a local context, or make the connection that Canadians can understand and identify with and support some of the work that we're doing. So there are a handful of coalitions that are more actively looking to partner with domestic-focused NGOs and domestic-focused coalitions, partly as a way of bridging that gap and that divide between the international and the domestic issues. Quick note on Southern voices. As was mentioned earlier, many of the coalitions represented in this room they say that their work is grounded in the work of their Southern partners and Southern networks. Notably, a lot of these connections are what I would say by proxy. Those Southern connections are through members who are members of coalitions. So there's an understanding that those voices will be represented in the coalition space by extension of the work of its members. Some are more intentional with conferences or events or call-ins to get Southern partners involved in the decision-making processes and the general information of coalitions. On a final note, to close off, sorry, actually we have two more slides to close this off. I'll go quickly. The funding question. Now there's a lot of red, especially on the left side there. This question, we're looking at 14 different coalitions and saying how their overall funding, how has their overall funding level changed since 2011. Obviously, some drastic cuts for a few on the left there. Some of the larger organizations experiencing some significant cuts. But if you click ahead to the next slide, if you exclude those three on the left, there's actually, on average, an increase of 15% in funding for coalition work. Again, a marginal increase, but noteworthy to say that while the overall numbers may represent a drastic decline, many coalitions are actually experiencing an increase. If you click to the next slide, you get a bit of a more zoomed in view of those other 8 coalitions or 9. Again, take it for what it is. Obviously, it's a bit more weighted on the left side. Some of those gains can help skew the overall average, but marginal increases are part of the scene. In terms of where it comes from, most coalitions, 21 out of 27, get funding from members directly, and then a third of coalitions overall are entirely funded by members, getting no grants outside of that. There are also, I think, 3 or 4 coalitions that operate on 0 budget, and it's just in-kind contributions for the work. In-kind contributions, of course, being a part of coalition work across the board, whether or not they have big budgets or not. I'll wrap up now with looking towards the 2015 landscape. 2 points to note here. We've heard already anticipations of the election for next year and how that's informed and shaped the priorities of coalitions for this coming year. Several are looking to have their campaigns highlighted as an election issue. Other coalitions are saying that they're monitoring the process and seeing where they might have opportunities of leverage. So an eye to the election. Of course, in international development, the post-2015 language also has connections to the UN, post-2015, the Sustainable Development Goals, that process. Not a lot of work done by coalitions related to that process. Maybe an indication of where the process has come over the last couple of years and opportunities of influence for coalitions. They may anticipate fewer opportunities, so they're not engaging so much. Again, 4 or 5 said that they were tracking that process and hoping that the priorities of their coalition would be represented in the SDGs going forward. Excellent. Okay, so what I'm about to share with you, the overlaps, the gaps, the concerns, considerations for CCIC going forward. I guess as a disclaimer, these are my perspectives. They're not necessarily endorsed by CCIC officially, but this is just the stuff that came forward as I was looking through the information that you shared with me. Let's look at the first area of overlap in terms of thematic overlap. As we've heard already this morning, there are a number of coalitions that are tackling the issue of international trade, looking at investment agreements, looking at local and national decision-making processes and some of these broader economic investment strategies. Looking at, I have 7 or 8 before me that are looking at specifically at particular trade or investment agreements. So this is something that a number of coalitions are doing. It's also connected to domestic resource mobilization, as we've heard earlier this morning, corporate activity, how that impacts on human rights, and incorporating local and indigenous populations in some of these broader decision-making processes. So, in terms of overlap, we're exploring the correlation here between trade, investment, and development. Perhaps it's something that's a reflection of the merger that happened 2 years ago, where we're seeing that closely connected on the government side of things as well. Is there some sort of larger narrative or common thread that we can pull as each of these are doing their analyses individually? The second one, the Canada, the UN, and multilateral bodies. Again, we heard this mentioned earlier, where there's a common critique emerging of how Canada is participating on the global stage. Well, we heard this through some of the trade liberalization agenda, to go back to that point, how those decisions impact people that we work with, but also Canada's deteriorating role at the United Nations. Some of those looking more directly in terms of the rights of Indigenous peoples, some looking at the climate issues and where Canada has taken a stand, or food security issues, as was mentioned with the responsible agricultural investment process. This, again, a common commentary is emerging here among different coalitions. Is there an opportunity to speak collectively about this? The enabling environment for civil society organizations is another common theme of overlap. We've got democratic rights with International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, with Voices, looking at shrinking space here in Canada for CSOs, freedom of assembly and expression being challenged. Obviously, there are coalitions who are looking at this in other contexts around the world. So this question of what is the Canadian context, what can Canada be doing to promote civil society space, to promote this enabling environment, both domestically and abroad? Is there a way that coalitions can feed into this process of speaking out on this issue? Fourthly, the ODA Accountability Act. Now, this act, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, having the three key pillars of poverty reduction, considering the perspectives of the poor, and upholding international human rights standards. Hearing those three, I'm sure you can all resonate with at least one of them, that the component of your work is related to the ODA Accountability Act. Now, the Canadian government, DFAT-D, just released its latest report on how it thinks it's doing in response to the ODA Accountability Act. Is there an opportunity, with so many of us working on these overlapping issues, is there an opportunity for a shadow report to say this is a civil society perspective on how Canada is doing on these issues? Moving on to some of the gaps then, we've covered a couple of the key overlaps. Looking at gaps, what's missing? You all have diverse agendas, there are points of correlation, but there are also notable gaps in the broader international development landscape. The first one I want to highlight is financing development. Obviously, there are funding challenges experienced by individual members, organizations, that because so many coalitions are directly funded by members, perhaps there are direct implications then for coalitions. Are your funding futures in question as well? Traditionally, the issue of financing development or financing forward development, FFD, that's something that, again, North-South Institute and the Halifax Initiative have traditionally looked at. With them closing, who's addressing this issue? Canada also has a unique role in the international scene on this, with Minister Paradis having the chair, holding the chair position of the Redesigning Development Financing Initiative, as well as we're thinking about the SDGs, there's a Financing for Development conference that's happening next July that will feed into that process, and asking this question, how are we going to fund the initiatives of development? How are we going to fund the goals and the objectives of our coalitions and our individual organizations? Now, Canadians for Tax Fairness is looking at the tax avoidance component of this, which is significant. But is there room for a new working group or a new reference group among organizations and among coalitions to look at financing development? Secondly, looking at the sustainable economic growth issue. This is one of the three key thematic areas of DFAT-D, or specifically the development side. And again, for the SEG strategy, it's looking at building economic foundations, growing businesses, and investing in the employment potential of all. We've talked already about some of the broader issues around trade and investment, which might fall into that first category of building economic foundations. So you're looking at investment agreements and trade agreements. Now, looking at growing businesses, investing in employment potential of all, no doubt there are organizations among us that are working towards these objectives in their regular work. Yet there doesn't seem to be a coalition that convenes organizations on this mandate. Is there room in the coalition landscape for a body like this? Thirdly, I want to note the gap of peace, security, and militarization. As we saw earlier, peace build obviously has been drastically reduced since 2011. Now it's currently going through a bit of restructuring and evaluating its membership, but also what its role is in the development sector. So maybe this is an area of opportunity for them to kind of itch where the sector is scratching. It's otherwise, peace, security, militarization is quite fragmented. Obviously, we have some of with Humanitarian Coalition, Humanitarian Response Network, we have groups that are looking at the conflict and fragile state side of this conversation. There's the Control Arms Coalition that is involved with the Arms Trade Treaty that looks at conflict. International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group is looking at anti-terrorism legislation and how that factors into the Canadian landscape. But again, taking a step back, the Pearson Centre closed last year, which held a huge part of the peace, security, and militarization work in this sector. How are we responding to this void? Is there space to bring forward a broader narrative or some sort of reference group on this? Finally, looking at policy and advocacy work in humanitarian response. This is a bit of a smaller area, but we do have the two groups that I mentioned that are working on humanitarian issues. Humanitarian Response Network, formerly PAGER, and Humanitarian Coalition. Both of them are looking at either coordinating a response in times of a crisis, or they're looking at more internal learning around humanitarian response work. But there's not a lot being done in terms of policy analysis and advocacy. So what can be done to respond to that gap? Moving on to the next slide, there are a couple of concerns and other gaps that came forward looking at the coalition landscape overall. I've highlighted, I guess, 5 of them there. Looking towards the election, again, we've talked about the election now and how our coalitions can use it as an opportunity to see change from the government. I'm wondering, are we crowding the plate on this? Do we have too many people trying to put forward their agenda? We're under no illusions that international development, let alone foreign affairs, gets a prominent role in election campaigns. Obviously, the domestic agenda takes priority during elections. So there's already a limited slice of the pie for this issue. Do we have too many people pushing individual messaging? Is there an opportunity here for the sector to have common messaging and kind of this notion of having a value proposition of a coalition? Is there one that we can all get behind and have as a key issue? The second point is, again, coming back to the issue of research. Now, there's a bit of thematic overlap in research. I'd say generally the research is very, very specific, very focused on issues that would interest the members of coalitions, but take, for example, the role of the private sector in development. A number of coalitions have taken on research initiatives to look at different dynamics pertaining to the private sector. Is there an opportunity for this research to be, at the very least, curated? Bring all these research initiatives together in a common space where people can look at what different coalitions are doing and compare reports side by side. If nothing else, that would help with creating a common narrative. Thirdly, I want to note, or bring into question, I guess, the awareness of thematic overlap. And I guess coming back to the entanglement of relationships. If you think back to the social networking graph that was on the screen during the other Jared's presentation, we all have connections with other coalitions. Many of the members of coalitions are also members of other coalitions. Sometimes that's the same person, other times it's multiple people from one organization that sit on different coalitions. Sometimes the work between coalitions is very intentional, doing a shared event or having shared policy messaging. But I guess I would challenge or put the challenge forward and say, how naturally does that, if I can use the overused word synergy, how often does that synergy actually happen? How aware are coalitions of, how aware are they of what other coalitions are doing? Even within coalitions that your own organization is a part of. I'd like to challenge that overlap. Fourthly, looking at the funding future, the question of, is this a priority, considering the funding future of coalitions? Member-funded coalitions is, as we saw already, very prominent. In asking many of you and other interviewees what are the funding futures for this coalition, there are a lot of expectations around maintaining the current structure. So we work with what we've got. What has worked for us so far should probably work for us in the future, and if we run into financial issues in the future and that shuts us down, well, so be it. That's the natural course of things. That's a bit difficult to reconcile with the strong faith that many of you have in your coalitions and the need of having that coalition space, and even how members perceived coalition space as something that's valuable. If it's so valuable, should we be doing more to be considering funding futures? Is it worth exploring funding mechanisms, doing fundraising workshops on how these coalitions can raise funds, even looking at the foundation community in Canada, if that's something to be explored. Now, the last point that you see on there, I guess a presentation from Jared Klassen wouldn't be complete without mentioning the private sector at least once. I mentioned earlier that many coalitions are looking to engage non-traditional members, people in the medical profession, engineers, lawyers, etc. I guess the question is, like, these alternative perspectives are valuable in this space, especially as you're looking at addressing very difficult development challenges. Is there a potential role for businesses to be involved in these kind of conversations? Now, I say that with a bit of trepidation. I know that it's a bit of a contentious issue in the sector of how closely do you work with the private sector. Especially, I was having some debates just over lunch around, you know, can they be part of the solution, or are they the cause of the problems in the first place? And reconciling that and having those conversations within groups is always an ongoing challenge. That said, if you're looking at diversity of perspectives and coming up with constructive solutions for development challenges, is it not worth considering how the private sector could be, how their voice could be heard in that setting? One other point that came up, it's not on the slides, but came up in conversation, was this idea of mission creep within coalitions. I think that's a notable concern. As I mentioned earlier, some of the expanding memberships in coalitions is because coalitions have broadened their mandates, saying, okay, we're looking at all things related to MNCH or whatever issue it is, and that's allowed them to increase their membership and get diverse perspectives. Is it too big of a mandate to manage within a coalition? Managing those broad objectives with specific priorities is definitely something that needs to be considered, especially given the changes in membership levels due to that factor. I'll conclude now just taking a couple minutes to consider how these findings could impact CCIC, and then we'll shift to questions after that. So I hope as I'm speaking that there are things that are coming forward that are maybe raising eyebrows or that need further clarification, but we'll have a fair chunk of time that we can talk through some of that after this. So implications then for CCIC. Now these are roles for CCIC to both continue and consider. Many of these things CCIC may already be doing. I don't want to pretend that these are all new concepts for CCIC, but this is also an opportunity to allow the voices of different coalitions and coalition leaders to affirm the work that CCIC is already doing. So the first one there is continuing to be an advocacy base. I think Sarah mentioned the amplification role that a coalition can bring, where you have a particular agenda that can be brought to a broader audience and amplify that campaign or that agenda or that finding. That's something that's important for CCIC. Many of you identified that as a key value of your relationship with CCIC, and a couple of you said that you're looking to do more in terms of joint advocacy or advocacy planning, whatever that could look like in the future. That connects with the second point of thinking of advocacy, but also policy capacity. in response to the question from the first half of my presentation about, what's this distinction between policy and program staff, where, and in response, seeing that a lot of organizations are feeling a bit of a pinch and that they don't necessarily have the resources to support policy staff where they used to. So they're focusing more on a programmatic agenda. Maybe this is something where CCIC could step in, where they could look at holding, workshops, different kind of learning opportunities to encourage policy capacity within the regular day-to-day of program work, and encourage individual members and representatives to bring in these policy considerations into their day-to-day work and their work with coalitions. The third point there is, again, looking at the issue of research and the changing dynamics of the research landscape in international development. Is it possible for CCIC to either create or support some sort of research hub? Now, I mentioned many organizations or many coalitions are doing research, but are they operating in silos? Are there connections between each other's research that we might not be able to identify? Is there a way that CCIC can play a role in convening some of the research that's out there? That could be as simple as the role of curating research publications. Maybe it's an online resource that's nice and searchable. I guess I'm thinking of like the ICN did the Global Hive, which is an online resource around public engagement. Could CCIC see something similar happening with research? Could they be a space where they connect research ambitions with potential academics or consultants that could take on this researching profile? Could there be an opportunity to connect with Klassen, for example? They have a journal on international development, the Canadian Journal of International Development Studies, or Development Studies. Could there be some overlap there where research being done by coalitions could share in the publication of that journal? Is there more room for overlap with IDRC as well on this issue, maybe connecting with Southern researchers on some of these issues? I guess the point I want to emphasize is there is research out there. There are these research venues like IDRC that exist. What is the unique civil society angle that we can bring to the world of research and international development? The fourth point then is maintaining a finger on the pulse at DFAT-D. This is, again, a voice of affirmation of what CCIC has done in their policy analysis, looking at, especially with working with the senior levels of the department and keeping track of some of the trends and some of the notable announcements that should be shared with the sector. I want to push us into a new paradigm in thinking of the whole of government approach with the merger of foreign affairs, trade, and development. Is there room for more engagement with senior level DFAT-D staff in kind of the fat part of DFAT-D? Should we be encouraging those relationships and creating a broader narrative? This is, again, thinking back to even some of the trade and investment work that's being done, where you're seeing this connection between those dynamics and development. Can we take some of that information? It's a two-way street. Can we take some of that information and that curated knowledge among us as coalitions and take that to DFAT-D? And furthermore, can CCIC play a role in saying this is what's happening on the foreign affairs and trade side of things, and these may be issues of interest or concern for the development community? The final point I want to raise is responding to some of the cross-cutting issues that are emerging, or that kind of the areas of overlap that I noted before, talking about Canada's role with the UN, looking at human rights issues and the ODA Accountability Act, looking at the enabling environments for civil society. These are all thematic areas. Can CCIC play a convening role, whether those be themes of conferences or workshops or further areas of research that can be commissioned? How can CCIC feed into some of those processes? Even looking towards 2015, are there certain aspects of these that should be highlighted as we think of approaching an election and some of the campaign mentality that CCIC is anticipating for the coming year. I'll end there and allow you to push back, to share some of your reflections, questions, things that need clarification. Again, I just want to emphasize that a lot of these are aggregate level considerations and findings. Obviously, there will always be exceptions within coalitions of how you operate and how you define your priorities, but these are some of the overall observations from the sector.